Welcome back. Welcome back. So happy to see you. This is my session on strategy, and I look forward to an exciting time together. For those of you who joined us so far for so long today, we just thank you for hanging in there with us, and we thank you. We often know that all of this information sometimes can be overwhelming, and we just ask you to take it piece by piece. But also we realize that that this is good information, and you need to have it. We need to get it into your hands. I often tell people or my students that if I make your head hurt, then I'm doing my job, right? It's more about getting this information into you, because I believe you can make more decisions once you have it, but also about putting the right tools in your tool belt. So today I'll be speaking about hope is not a strategy, and also identifying some ways to use these tools to your best advantage. Again, my name is Corbett. I'm with the University of San Diego's Nonprofit Institute. I oversee all governance programs and community programs, so I'm excited to be here today with you. So let's just dive in here. When we talk about nonprofits, people often speak about mission, vision, and values. So when we talk about mission, we talk about the societal need and answering the question of why, whereas vision, we're talking about what the organization should look like. And then lastly, values. These are the guiding principles. We'll spend a little bit more time on core values. I literally do sessions full just on core values. I believe they're extremely important. But when we talk strategy, you often at times do not see that on people's websites. You also don't see people talking about strategy too much. But of course it happens. So what I want to spend time doing is talking about strategy. I teach strategic planning at the University of San Diego's in their higher education program and nonprofit leadership. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. So my goal is threefold. One is making sure you understand the need for strategy, identify tools and best practices, and then lastly, be introduced to an alternative approach to strategic planning. Okay, so in order to do good strategy, we really have to look at what is going to be our strategy and how we put it into action. So therefore, I'm going to share a couple of different models that I find that have worked extremely well for nonprofits of all sizes, and then we'll talk a little bit about those. We'll also be taking some questions for you towards the end here. So I believe that strategy, this definition by David LaPiana, is an important one. So strategy is a coordinated set of actions, right, that are aimed at creating and sustaining a competitive advantage in carrying out the nonprofit mission. Interestingly enough, people will say, what is the most important word in this sentence? Often at times when I'm talking to people, they will talk about coordinated. We have to realize that strategy is about coordination, figuring out how can we all do this together. Some people just say, well, the strategy is important. Knowing that you have to have a defined strategy is important. People talk about creating and sustaining. Right? So look at that. How are we creating and how are we sustaining? What people don't like having is that people show up, they do one event, and then they leave. Right? That's not about sustaining change. So how are we going to sustain? And then also that competitive advantage. People look at nonprofits and they say, well, you know, we like each other. We don't need to be talking about competitors. Well, the reality is it's not about talking about competitors. It's not about how can I stomp out my competition. It's more so about what makes me unique, different, that allows my services to hit a specific population. So what is my competitive advantage over other ones, which makes people want to come to me? And if people tell me, well, I don't have a competitive advantage, I don't know my competitive advantage, I'm all the same, then you have to ask yourself, then, is how unique is it? Is your service needed? All right, and if your service is needed and it's unique enough, I believe it's important to have, but you have to know it's unique enough as well. So, basic strategy model. We start with A, which is we believe we're here and we're trying to get to B. The question is, what are we going to do to get there? This blue box here is very, very interesting because people at times, they get lost in that box. They get caught in that box, right? And it's just like, well, we're here. And then sometimes people will ask us a question and we never get to B. So it's basic strategy model. So what are we essentially going to use in order to start with A? And then what are we steps that we're going to take in this box in order to get to B? Sometimes I'm in a meeting and people are like, well, we're going to do this, 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 and that. And I say, okay, slow down for a second. So we're at A. So what is your recommendation for get us to B? Because I'm clear in my mind, it makes sense for me. So this is a simple, basic strategy model that is extremely helpful for people understanding. So that's the first model I'm introducing. What are some ways that we can look at this? I believe that most strategies, almost All strategy has to be thought about in where you are as an organization in your organizational life cycle. All right, so right here, as you can see, we have a startup phase, then we go to adolescent, mature, and defunct. What's very important like this is you can compare this to a human life cycle. So startup, of course, is going to be an infant. Adolescent is going to be a teenager. We realize that we don't talk to infants the way we talk to our teenagers. So what that's just telling us is that at different stages, organizations have different needs. So at different stages, organizations have different needs. So if we look at it that way, we'll realize that at a startup phase, our needs are going to be different. The amount of money we need, the different type of resources that we need, also the training that we need, but also the people that we need to get there. It's very much like the old adage, what got us here won't get us there. So therefore, we know that we're going to have different needs, and in order for it to take us to the next level, we're going to need unique resources at each stage. What's funny about this also is nonprofits often talk about, oh, we just want to sustain. We want to sustain. Well, the reality is that if you do what you need to sustain and you don't do something to renew, you're at risk of declining and ultimately dissolution. Doesn't mean that you have to start declining to renew. You can renew at any stage. And what happens is that people will do something impactful in their organization to renew. I'll give you an outside example. Apple computers, when people stop talking about Apple, what Apple does is they release a new phone. Once they release a new phone, they're renewing and people start talking about it again. Best way to renew organizational leadership in a nonprofit organization is to add one board member. When you add one board member, they start asking questions. They have a fresh set of eyes. So one way to renew from an organizational standpoint is to add members to your team. I'm speaking about it from a board perspective, but it also can be from a team perspective. A new fresh set of eyes asking those hard questions for the group. So it's interesting that, so we have to look at this in a unique way to say to ourselves, well, if my needs are going to be different, what specifically do I need? Where are we? And where are we going? So these are some specific points. Now, I do these type of presentations for boards all over the country. So when I look at it this way, I always tell somebody, I take green dots and blue dots. I said, I want you to put where you feel your organization is on the organizational life cycle. I want you to use the green dot for that. Now I want you to also rate your team. Where do you think your team is on an organizational life cycle? So take a look at this diagram here. So I asked them, this is real life, it was on a Saturday a couple of years ago, and I said, okay, these darker ones that look like black on this screen here, green or dark, the darker ones right here, that's where this team felt like their organization was, and then the blue dots are telling where we think the team is. Now, people will say something like, well, it looks like the organization is more mature, where the organization, whereas the team in blue is a little bit immature in the adolescent phase. Some other people say, well, it looks like they're going to have a hard time. You know, of course, we're going to look at things from a negative aspect, but what I see here is I see some positive things. First thing I see some symmetry. All of the black dots essentially are together, all of the blue dots are together, right? There's one dot over here, but as researchers, we call these outliers and we throw them out of the way. Because what we don't want people to do is to start having a full conversation about one blue dot. Right? So we throw away our outliers and we have a conversation about what do we see here. So I see that people are together. They're a little thinking it's not all mixed up. What I also noticed by looking at this is that if I know an organization is already at risk of declining, what type of group do I want to help turn it around? Well, often at times I want a group or a team that's in the adolescent phase, because the adolescent phase, sometimes they take more risk. Sometimes they have a little bit more energy and they're ready to move things a little bit in a different direction. So this could be seen as a positive way. But what it does is that people say, well, what's right, what's wrong? I believe that this is a starting point for us to open up the conversations. So if we're able to have conversations like this, then we're able to ask ourselves, well, what direction are we moving? What are our needs now? And what are our needs to get to the next level? These organizational life cycles are age interdependent. Independent. And what that means is that somebody could be 100 years old and be at the startup phase, right? Somebody could be 3 years old and be moving along pretty quickly. So every stage is going to be different. The question is, what's going to get me to the next stage? And then from that, you can talk about what is going to be my strategy. but you often at times are going to start somewhere like this. There's a lot of literature out there on organizational life cycles that you can continue to look up. This is my explanation. It's a real life example. Oddly enough, this one blue dot over here, which again, we don't spend a lot of time on, this happened to be the founder of the organization, because often at times people are like, well, we tried this, we tried that, right? But as this person was able to see it, they were like, oh, now it makes sense. But also they started to realize when they started thinking about their team, although they've tried it, they didn't try it at this level, nor did they try it with this team. So these are some things that you're going to want to think about as you start looking at organizational life cycles. I like this quote of Will Rogers when we talk about strategy. It says, even if you are on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there, right? So again, I teach strategic planning, so often at times we'll tell people, if you're not moving forwards, you're moving backwards. What are some ways and what are some opportunities for us to continue to look about and think about strategy and continue to look at our surroundings, come up with a plan and then put it into action, right? Developing a good strategy, an important part. What I'm gonna introduce to you is different strategy models as I noted. The first one here is the 90-day micro strategy model. I love this model because it talks about what are we going to do in 90 days? Why 90 days? Well, 90 days because often at times people will say, if you can do it for 90 days, it becomes more of a ongoing pattern for you. You're able to kind of like embrace it more. So this isn't for strategic planning. We'll talk about strategic planning in a little while. But Dave Logan, great guy. He developed this model, the 90-day micro strategy model. He does a great job at it. He has a couple of YouTube videos on it also, and has a great organization that he uses to work on that. I'm going to give you an example of the 90-day strategy model that I used with an organization. I used it quite some time ago. This is how long I've been supporting this. Use it quite some long. There's an organization back in Sacramento, and they do folklore dancing. So what they would do is they would go around the community in Sacramento and perform their folklore dancing. I mean, it was incredible. They had kids from 3 to 5 years old all the way up to adults, different groups. And I mean, this group was incredible. When they and I started working together, they asked me, well, we're trying to do some things in our groups. So I said, well, this is incredible. You'd like to try and move your organization forward. Tell me right now, how are you making revenue? Because it sounds like you're traveling 20, 30 times to different locations to really make sure that people are seeing who you are, but also making sure that your mission is being met. Well, I found out that they actually said, well, we do go around, but we don't charge people. And I was just like, wow. Well, they said, well, we don't want to go to places where we have to dance and then go around and collecting money in buckets. That's not what we want. So I started asking them, and this conversation came up about like core values and what core values are. Again, I can talk to you about core values all day long, but this micro-strategy model helps bring it out for us a little bit. And it starts here with what our core values are. I believe it's very hard to talk about strategy and implementing a strategy if you don't think about your core values. Core values are extremely important. I define, and Dave Logan defines it as that without I can't go on living. That which without I can't go on living. That's how important it is. I'll give you an example. If somebody called me up and said, Lynn, we want to pay you 3 times your salary. I was like, okay, that's great. They said, well, we're going to want you to move to Utah. Sorry if anybody's from Utah. We want you to move to Utah, and we want you not to be in a learning institution. Well, I'd say, you know, this is great. Love to get 3 times my salary. However, you want me to move and I can't take my family. Well, I have a little boy at home. His name is Lynn also, and I love him 90% of the time, right? So I want to be with my family, my wife and my son. I'd like to be wherever I go. Also, learning is important to me. I'm in the final stages of my dissertation. So I'm finishing up a dissertation, and I'm like, you know what? Learning and continual learning is important to me. So therefore, I would say, thank you for the offer, but my core values are going to not allow me to take you up on that opportunity. In fact, they tell you that people who are operating in their core values, and people refer to them as strengths as well, they make more money, they live longer, and they're generally happier. This is based on the Strengths Finder information. Generally happier when you're operating in your strengths. Oddly enough, if people see something that they like, they tell one person. They see something that they don't like, they tell 10 people. And now with Yelp, they tell thousands. So the point here is we believe in a society that's always going to point out what is not there as opposed to looking at people for their strengths. Another example is that if my supervisor gave me a rating, they said, Lynn, in these 10 areas, 9 you did exceptionally well, and this one area you did not so well. So what I do is I go home, I get out my favorite ice cream, my favorite movie, and I'm gonna cry because I didn't do good in this one area. When the reality is I did well in 9 areas. And what my boss says is that we're gonna work with you to get you better on that one area. That is not my strength. Why are we focusing on what I'm not doing so well as opposed to strengthening what I am doing well? So when we look at organizations, it's the same way. What are our core values for the organization? What are we known for our strengths for the organization? And should we be pouring into the strengths? Now, that's not to say that there aren't some areas that we all need to develop in, but pouring into those areas that often at times end up taking away from your strengths or what you're good at is sometimes what the challenge is. So this allows us to, one, start with our core values. So organizations who are doing a strategy model very similar to this, they're going to look at their core values and they're going to identify what they are. Then they're going to look at it as a three-way conversations between core values, your assets, and then everything that you will do. Okay? The first thing you have to do up here is you have to look at it and say, what am I trying to accomplish? We definitely want to make it sure it's measurable. What do I already have? What are my assets? And then lastly, what is everything that I'm going to do? Often at times people start at their assets and then they never get to here. And sometimes there's a lack of clarity around what they are trying to accomplish, right? So if you want more information on this, Culture Sync, David Logan is the president over there, and he's doing some great work. So I'll give you an example. Another example of this is when I look at everything that I'm going to accomplish, it's better to start with my assets. So I'll give you an example. I often at times tell people, if we're going to throw a party, what are some things that we should be concerned about? What should we do? People say, oh, we're going to throw a party. Okay, let's talk about that. Well, we're going to know venue. We're going to need to know location. We're going to need to know what the theme is. We're going to need to know the invite list, what type of cake we're going to have, alcoholic beverages, what are we going to have? Well, the reality is that people often at times start talking about what it is that they want to accomplish and what they're going to do versus talking about what their assets are. So if we were going to throw a party, the first thing that we might ask is, has anybody thrown a party like this before? That person would be an asset. Is anybody an events planner? That person would be an asset. Oh, we have a building. That's an asset. Oh, we already have relationships with people who provide food for us. Those are all assets. The challenge by not identifying your assets first, you automatically start thinking about actions. Oh, I'll call this person, I'll call that person, and it's not totally thought out. And what you want to really do is look at this and try and figure out how can I think about my assets completely, and how do I write those things down. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go back to the organization in Sacramento, and I'm going to walk you through what I did with them, and that'll help us kind of like get there. This was back then, so interestingly enough, it was something that I did with them back in 2015. Again, it's a three-way conversation. This was the form that we used to use before we upgraded it. So what is it that you want? What are the things that you have? And everything that you will do. So what I did was I worked with them. Over here, you'll look at 6, 12, 13. This literally, I worked with them on in 2013. Sorry, right? So that this was a way that we looked at this and said, wow, in 2013, I worked with him for this long ago. And this is how long I've been using a model like this. So when I worked with them initially, what I said was, tell us what your core values are. Once I opened it up to them and I said, okay, tell me what your core values are, right? So we started talking about their core values was Mexican heritage. Interestingly enough, being up in Sacramento, once a year, they would actually come down to LA, stay at a church overnight, and then drive all the way into Mexico so they could have authentic Mexican attire, right? That's how important their heritage was to them. The second thing that they looked at was, they said that one of ours is determination. Regardless of how we are, where we're going, we're an organization on the move, so we're determined. The other thing is they had collaboration. How are we collaborating in our organization? What is our integrity, right? We didn't want people around asking for money, holding buckets around with our little kids. Integrity, and then also our commitment. So when I said, well, you do 20 to 30 of these, why do you keep going if you're not really making any money on them? Because we're committed. Our core value is commitment. If they call, we come. Our core value is collaboration. We have these collaboration with partners that we've had for years. So they're living out their core values, but it's not really beneficial for them in the long run. And that's why they started talking about what the strategy that we need to develop. We came up with this idea. We said we're going to increase the number of individual donations by 40%. They wanted to increase the number of individual donations by 40%. My question always is it measurable? Well, yes, 40% is measurable. It tells us what we're trying to aim towards, right? It's also time dated, right? So this was 2013, but this was 90 days previously to it. So we said when we were looking at it, it said 6/12/13. We knew that we wanted our 90-day period to end there, and we had to do our actions to make sure we're going to hit this 90-day period. For those of you who need access to these forms, they're easily downloadable. We have uploaded them into our system so that you can pull them down and you can work with us also on this. One other way that people talk about how they can identify their own core values, sometimes you go online, you print out a list of core values, and then I work with my teams and I say, okay, if people were to, so what are our core values? Sometimes people have them posted. Other times people say, well, we have our mission and vision. We sometimes have value, but we wouldn't say they're core values. I say take a list of values, start with 10. What are your top 10? Narrow them down to top 5. Most people have between 5 and 7. And then you start working with them. I don't think that you should start at the board level. I think you should start at the staff level. Because meanwhile, you want to make sure that these core values are alive and they're being implemented. And whereas if somebody says, well, the board came up with those, we didn't come up with them. So you work at the staff level, identify them, work with the board level, and allow the organization to embrace it. Some people say, well, we can't come up with core values because we just never had any. I tell them, if I stood outside your building and I asked people around your building, what do you think this organization's core values are? They would tell us, right? So because you live your core values. So even though you haven't identified them, people can identify what they believe to be your core values. And I say, why not identify them yourselves rather than people labeling you on what you believe, particularly because core values are so important. So those are just 2 quick ways that you can look at core values. To getting back to our model here, so now that we've had our core values, the first thing that we were going to ask them is that, so we know what they're trying to accomplish, right? Increase the number of individual donations by 40%. They chose that because they felt like that was going to help get them where they needed to be. And what their overall goal was to, of course, increase revenue and make some relationships. And it was captured in that. So the first question that I asked is, what are the assets? What are some of the things that you already have? Okay, what are our assets? What are some things that you already have? So they started talking about a network of relationships, right? They had people. They would go to these events, so they had relationships, and it tied into their core values. So that was an asset that they had. So they didn't start talking about, hey, let me call this person, let me call that person. They started talking about the assets that they have. So first one is the network of relationships. They also had an available budget. So if they wanted to come up with something, they did have some money set aside that they could say, well, we could implement a strategy with this. The other thing that they had was available space. They were, like I said, a Mexican dance troupe essentially, and they had a space where they would hold shows, activities, training sessions, different activities. So they did have available space. They also had Mexican connections. I mentioned that they would travel down. So they did have some Mexican connections that would help them. They had a strong parental base, right? The parents were very, very involved in the activities. So they had a strong parental base. They also had instructors, right? Instructors that would be provide instruction to the different entities that they had and different services. They had consultants, but then they also had a calendar of events. A significant calendar of events that allowed people to see, well, we're going to go here in March, we're going here in April. So when I looked at it and I asked, are all of those assets that you have? Sometimes I'll tell a group, oh, those are some great list of assets, but you're missing a couple. And then they go back and they say, oh yeah, we forgot this. Like I had no idea, that's a facilitated trick, right? I had no idea that if they had it or not. But the point here is that sometimes we have to think deep enough in order to identify our assets, sometimes the things that are already in place. The other things that we have, Google is an asset, right? We can look it up and find out, oh, this has been done this way. People have done that way. How have people increased their number of donations by 40%, right? So now what we see, if you see that yes and no, the Y and N at the top of the sheet there, what it says is that do we think we have enough assets in order to get to our goal, which is increase the number of individual donations by 40%. So this is a good list, but let's say if we say, no, that's not enough. That just means you're under asseted, and that is not a word, right? Just means you're under asset. You do not have enough assets. So what you want to do is go back out and find out more assets before you go to the next stage. So for this and the purposes of our discussion here, we're going to say that's a pretty good list. We're going to ask ourselves, is that something that we feel is enough assets? We're going to say yes. Once we're able to say yes, we're able to move on to our next stage. Remember, it's a conversation, right? What you're trying to accomplish, your assets, and then your actions, right? All undergirded by your core values. So I'm going to go through each of these actions and we'll explain them. So the first thing that they wanted to do was conduct a board assessment, right? So the question was, well, why do they want to conduct a board assessment? Well, they want to conduct a board assessment is because they believe that their board could help them move this forward. So if their board can help them move this forward, or board members can help them move them forward, they're looking at it saying, we need to conduct a board assessment and we need to identify 5 new board members. So my question is, why do you think that they're trying to identify 5 new board members, right? And the answer to that is, they believe that if they do 5 new board members, that would help them increase the number of individual donations by 40%. You always want to make sure you stay on top of what you're trying to accomplish, right? Individual donations, they're not talking about corporations here. Their goal was increase the number of individual donations by 40%. And this is one way to help them, right? Create a list of current and past supporters. Why do they want to create a list of current and past supporters? Because creating that list of past and current supporters will increase the number of individual donations by 40%, right? If I'm developing this list of individuals, these lists of groups, then I have it. They just so happen that they weren't tracking them. Were they getting donations in? Of course. Are there systems to track them? Of course. But back then they weren't tracking them. So figuring out how do we track a system so that we know who is supporting us now and who supported us in the past. With the knowledge that those who supported us in the past, there was something about them that made them want to support us. So we already have them. They're already an asset of ours. How do we turn that around to help us increase the number of individual donations by 40%? I keep saying that not to lose sight of it. We've all sat around the table, we start talking about something, then somebody will say something and all of a sudden we're in another place. All of a sudden somebody says, well, why don't you just call John? He has a lot of friends. Everybody jumps out there and they start making phone calls. Meanwhile, they didn't go through all of their lists. They didn't go through all of their assets, and they're putting all their marbles into one basket. And you want to make sure that you're clear about ways that we can have further opportunities. Develop a list of current vendors. Who are the individuals that they work with on an ongoing basis, right? We have a relationship. We've been paying for water service. We've been paying for a number of different services to keep our facility running. We should be able to go back to them and say, we have had a relationship. We're looking for people who can continue to support our organization. This could be a list of people that you can approach. Individual corporations, of course, but often at times the relationships are formed by individuals. So why choose that? Because we believe it's going to increase the number of individual donations by 40%. The next one is that also identifying the businesses in the surrounding community. This was a very interesting one. Identify the businesses in the surrounding community. Often at times as nonprofits, we're working so hard, head down, getting the work done. Heads down, focusing on our community, meeting the needs, trying to implement our mission. But you're not looking up at times to figure out what's going on in your community. Right? I often at times people say, Lynn, what's your definition of a leader? Well, my definition of a leader is I use as describing it as an image. A leader is somebody who is standing at the door looking out ahead, where a manager is somebody standing at the door looking inward. All right? A leader of an organization, I didn't say that they're out in the community, I said they're at the door. So they're often at times keeping one foot in the organization so they can know what's going on, often at times being able to provide assistance when necessary, but they're also looking ahead so they can forge ahead. Right? So if that's the case, for me, one description image of a leader is somebody who's at the door, one foot in, one foot out, but they're looking in trying to lead their group. It just so happens for this group, California Endowment, a few years ago it ended, the California Endowment picked 10 communities over 10 years to give money to, $1 million a year. Their goal was They picked 10 communities, giving each of those communities $1 million each year, giving it out to communities to try and make impact in certain neighborhoods. Believe it or not, they were right smack in the middle of that neighborhood in Sacramento, California. I made that connection. That was one of their first foundation grants. But it was already going on. There was no magic here. It's just about knowing. And by knowing is keeping a pulse on the community. What I want to happen is if somebody comes in our community and they're about to do something, I want to be that advocate. I want to be that person that people are calling on because I'm known for being that person in the community who is in the know and also cares about this community. The other one that they did, they wanted to do developing mechanisms of giving, right? They did not want their children walking around with buckets after performances. One of the mechanisms that we developed was they had these envelopes, right? What they would do is they would leave all these envelopes at different places. Sometimes they would be different colors. What they found is that people thought about them different times of the year and they put money in and then they would mail it to them. Self-addressed envelopes. They would mail it back to the place. They would open these envelopes up and somebody who they touched their heart 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, they were able to send back to the place. So this way they were able to track a new mechanism of giving. But interestingly enough, as people were giving, that was helping them increase the number of individual donations, right? People felt like during the holidays at different times, they would get all these added resources in there. Just an incredible way of looking at things a little bit differently for this group, right? So this helped them increase the number of their individual donations. Then the last one here is that, last two, the first one is they wanted to conduct a participant assessment. They knew that some people wanted to give, but they wanted to know how was this working? How was their program impactful? So they could tell people some individual stories that were very, very powerful, but they wanted to know, can we look at this in a different way where we can show and talk about figures? Think about how long ago this was. This is 2013, so a lot of people weren't talking about figures as much back then. So I applaud them for looking at that and trying to say, how are we gonna know our program is good? Well, one way we can know our program is good is by looking at it through the eyes of the people who are potential funders and individuals who care about this work. It's going to help our program anyway. So they started conducting a participants assessment. So they had some good data to share. And the last one that they did, they said that they were going to host 2 friend raisers, right? I didn't say fundraisers, 2 friend raisers. Right now, they wanted to increase the individual donations by 40%. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a friend raiser because now I'm going to bring people in and I'm going to have them come together. I'm going to tell them about our program, maybe have a performance, but individually, we're going to try and make the connection with them, try and bring them on as our friends and friends of other friends and bring them to the table, knowing that we have a good program here, knowing we have some good data, we know the information, but it's a friend raiser, right? So now that helped me in order to help make sure that I'm reaching my goal. Did they reach their goal? They definitely reached their goal. They blew it out of the water. They were very, very happy. I was happy. The people around them and their families were happy also. The question always is that if we were going to run a fundraiser, if we were going to do a fundraiser, what does that look like? Well, I say, okay, well, what does it look like? Well, a fundraiser, maybe we need to talk about food. Maybe we need to talk about who we're going to invite. The answer to this question is that you do another 90-day strategy, right? That was a setup question. So you do a 90-day strategy. So you take friend-raiser. Now you say, I'm going to host a friend-raiser. I'm going to host 2 friend-raisers. And this is how many people I want to attend. Now, 2 friend-raisers could be measurable because you want 2, but I will break it down further. So you have a clear objective that you're trying to reach. Then you start with the same core values, usually if it's the same organizations. You start talking about your assets and you start talking about your actions. I know some people who have multiple 90-day strategy for the uniqueness. For them, these are small aspects and 90 days is the perfect amount of time for them to do it in. It stays fresh on their team. What you'll start realizing is that although this is an incredible strategy that you can use in order to move your organization forward with a particular task, I use this just as a regular questionnaire for people, right? It's a great party trick, right? Somebody says, hey, there was a young man who I was sitting next to and he seemed a little frustrated. I started having a conversation with him and he said something about, hey, well, I'm trying to move from here and I'm trying to move out of state and I really want to move to this place. So I said, great. So when are you trying to move by? He says, well, I'm trying to move in the next X amount of days. So my first question for him wasn't like, well, where are you moving? Oh, you should try this, or you should call this person. I asked him, what do you currently have that's going to help you reach that goal? That was a question reworded in, what were your assets? Right? Asking him, what are your assets first? He started running them off, talking about all these people he knew in that state that he wanted to move to, things he knew about that state, schools that he knew about that state. He talked about the research of it. He talked about how the different, comparing what $1 is worth here versus $1 there. So all of those things helped him have an informed decision. So he had the assets, and then we started talking about actions. Woman told me that she did this with her son. As soon as she learned this model, she did it with her son. They're eating dinner, he wants to make a decision, she starts talking to him about it. But you're really teaching a way of thinking. My team knows that I'm gonna ask these things first. So they start talking about assets first, right? So they start talking about that before we start talking about our actions. So we're brainstorming as a team together. Again, 90-day strategy model. We have the handouts online. This is something that I continue to talk about. There are other people that do it. This has a foundation from a military base. Right? So this is a number of different people do it in a number of different ways. I found this way to be the easiest. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to introduce that to you in a strategy that's going to really allow us to move the organization forward. Okay, so just remember the last phase here is, will your actions accomplish your outcomes? So we have 2 yes and no. Do you have assets here? And then the last one here is, will your actions accomplish your outcomes? If you identify you have everything done, all of your actions, and you find that it will not help you accomplish your outcomes, you have to add more actions. The other thing I want to note is that you'll find that a lot of these, your assets, end up turning into actions, of course, right? Available budget, how does that look? That helps us maybe conduct a participant assessment, network of relationships. That helps us identify board members. So you'll start to see a relationship between your assets and actions, which further supports this 3-way conversation that's occurring. So you ask yourself these questions. Now, at the end of this, I often at times tell people to share it with 5 of their friends. Why 5 of my friends? Well, as you show it to them and you tell them what you accomplished, they're going to say, did you forget about this person? This person works here. Did you forget about that person? So they're going to help ask other questions. They're going to help flush this out just a little bit more, so that you can say, okay, I have enough information here. It's added to it, but they're also accountability partners. They say, when are you trying to accomplish this? All right, good. I'll put it down in my calendar. Maybe 30 days from now, I'll put it down and I'll check with you to see how you're doing on the process. So these are very important, but also very different ways to look at strategy. So we just talked about this for the last 20, 25 minutes or so, but it was something that could have easily happened in a group, could have easily happened at your table, easily happened in your boardroom. Ways to look at it uniquely about what we're trying to do and how it's going to get us there. So this is, again, a clear example of that. All right? So that's one model. Another model that I think is important, and many of you may know that, is that the 8-step Kotter model of change. So John Kotter, I love this book. He calls it The Heart of Change. Another book that I've had for a number of years. They came out with a new version of it. It's updated with some figures. But what I find is that if I am not using a model, I often at times lose steps, right? One of the biggest things that I've done over the last several years was to go back and get my PhD, and I found it to be phenomenal because there were things that I were doing that were already a model that I've developed. But by studying and by looking at various models, I could add on to my model, and there often at times were very important points that I could add. This 8-step Kotter model I have been doing for a number of years. Let me explain it to you as a second model that you can use, and then we'll show you 1 or 2 more models also. So 8-step John Kotter model of change, right? So every time that I've realized that I've done really, really well, I've hit these steps. When I know I didn't do so well, I realized I left out a step. So I'm pulling this information out. I'm strategizing with my team. How are we going to implement change? How are we going to implement change in a way to help us be successful in moving forward in our next steps? Well, the first one is we're going to create a sense of urgency, right? What is it that's going to really allow us to have time to move forward? Sometimes people will say, we lost 10% last year. Some companies, Fortune 500 companies, will say, oh, we're down like 6% or we're down 15%. They find that if there's a sense of urgency, people will change. But if there's not a sense of urgency, there's not motivated to change. So step number 1, there always has to be a sense of urgency. Step number 2 is you want to create a coalition, or what some refer to as a guiding team. Often at time, the guiding team is comprised of members that we already know, people from our team, people from our organization, but it may be some naysayers also. I'd rather have a naysayer in the room asking the questions in our room rather than waiting till us to finish our process and then have somebody ask questions. So sometimes you pull different people in the room that have different levels of influence, different opinions, different approaches, and then we can look at it. Now, I don't see any questions, but if there are questions that are coming up, please feel free to continue to feed them in, and I'll try and make sure that I answer them as they continue to come in. So the next one is develop a vision and strategy. What is my vision and strategy for this change? What is it going to look like when we accomplish this? All right. I often at times when I'm doing coaching with people, I say, what does success look like? Or by the end of our call, what does a success look like for this call? And specifically, people will provide that. Well, you have to look at this as painting a picture for people. What is it going to look like when it's done? So that I'm clear on the vision, I'm clear on our strategy also. So painting this picture. The next one is communicating the vision. Sometimes people move in a direction, but they don't communicate. How am I communicating a vision to people, right? Making sure that that's a step that we put forward to. So it's not saying, okay, we agreed to this, but we're communicating so people can buy in. It's almost like a shared value, right? What is my shared value? How am I going to go, shared vision? How am I going to go about implementing a shared vision to increase our value? So the next one is empower action. What are the things that we're going to do as specific actions to move a process forward? Right. Specifically, what are we going to do? Knowing what we know now, we have a guiding team, we have a vision, we have a strategy, we've painted our picture. What is it going to look like? So we've empower action. That's us starting to take initiative. They often talk about the next step being quick wins. How do I share these quick wins? Right? People often at times, you want them to say, oh, I can see that there's movement because I can see that you have these wins accumulating. So let's say if we were in a group and I said, hey, we want to raise $100,000, and somebody says, okay, I will give you $10,000. I mean, that's just incredible. The challenge is if somebody says $10,000, somebody's like, oh, well, they're on their way. Maybe I don't need to give. This is my opinion. Sometimes people are like, hey, that's a great start. So often at times, sometimes you want to be able to announce that you've gotten a donation quickly. Other times, you may not want to announce it as quickly or talk to people or talk about, can we double it in a certain way? Can we have a matching program? Figuring out what's my strategy to continue to move forward, but also to create these short wins. That was a finance example. There could be other ways of examples, right? In this time, in these pressing times, you will have to come up with different strategies in a way to continue to move things along. And looking at change and social change, these are some of the models that you can use and or aspects of a model that you can use. So the next one is leveraging some of your wins to drive change. If you know that if you've pushed an area and you have that accomplished, how do I leverage that? Leverage that to move things into a stronger position for ourselves. So looking at it from a strategic standpoint, which direction are we going? And then also less than making it stick. They refer to talk about embedding it in your culture. How do you make it stick? What systems do we have to put in place? What policies do we have to put in place, right? The only way that you're gonna have it is if you invest time in it, you invest the systems approach and figuring out ways to look at it, right? What worked really well? What do we need to implement? What do we need to shift, right? So the eight-step Cotter model of change is one way we look at implementing changes on our organization, ensuring that we have the steps that we need in order to ensure that that happens. So it says here, people hardly talk at the table when great food is being served. People hardly talk at the table. People hardly talk at the table when great food is being served. You'll have to expand on that a little bit, but you're right. If you are moving forward and you have this good information, you're going to actually move a group forward. I'm hoping you're also talking about getting this team together and the guiding team as one way to look at that. So those are two models that I want to show you. I want to make sure in our time that I cover strategic planning with you a little bit because it's important. In our model, there was there was something that I talked about. It's a boomerang strategy. It's a very another model that I emphasized that I put in there. I developed that model as if the world needs another strategy model, but I developed that model. It's a different way to look at it because sometimes people want something that's not strategic planning, but also not a 90-day strategy. They want something in between. So that boomerang model is built for that. So, but I do want to cover strategic planning. David LaPiana, president of the TCC group based out of New York, does some great work around strategic planning. As I do strategic plans, this is the model I use. As I teach strategic planning at the University of San Diego, this is the model I use. I love this. Strategic planning focuses on establishing your organizational direction, setting priorities, and identifying obstacles and opportunities that may limit or enable your ability to a nonprofit to carry out its mission. The ability of the nonprofit to carry out its mission. Any strategic plan that you do, often at times, people will talk about a SWOT analysis. What are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? Often at times, I use this SWOT model on a lot of different things. How was our event? Let's talk about it. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. For me, is that the best model to use everywhere? I think our team needs one, so we're just not throwing things all out in the air. So I use a model like SWOT also. People don't use this too much. This is called a PEST analysis. A lot of your business schools will talk to you about this. And this is, what are our political factors, economical factors, social factors, and technological factors, right? So people often at times would say, well, why use a PEST versus SWOT? I happen to use both of them. I'll give you an example. So when the San Diego Chargers left, and for those of you who don't know, the San Diego Chargers have left. Sorry if this upsets you, but we all have been upset for quite some time. So if we look at that and we said the San Diego Chargers may leave, if we rewind a little bit, if we did a SWOT analysis and we were talking about how the San Diego Chargers had supported us in the past, the SWOT analysis will be like, okay, this is great. It may or may not bring up some of the challenges. Whereas when we look at PEST and you have a high political factor, that's going to make sure that it comes up. So often at times that people are going to look at things uniquely, and asking these key questions are going to be the way to do it. So PEST analysis, what are our political factors, economic factors, social factors, and technological factors? It's just another different way of kind of like looking at that. Another model that people use is the SOAR model. Some people don't like talking about weaknesses. I mentioned about how important strengths is. So the SOAR model is what some people do. What are your strengths? Where are opportunities? What are our aspirations as an organization? And then lastly, what are our results? How do we know we are succeeding? Again, I'm pushing a lot at you because I know that different strategies work for different groups, right? Each of these strategies that I mentioned to them, you can go and do a little bit more research on them. You can work with them to figure out what are my next steps? What's going to work best for me, for my situation? Again, tools in the tool belt for you. So different tools that you can use at different times. Right? I find that there are tools that I pull out often at times that I haven't used in a while, but there's different tools that I can use, right? I mean, I told somebody the other day, if I saw somebody who told me that they were going to do a project for me, and I look at their tools and they're all nice and shiny, I'm going to say, hey, this is great, but you might not be the person for me. Whereas if somebody comes up to me and their tools are been used and you can see they have distinct marks on them, like they've been using them constantly, then often at times that's the person that I'm going to say, hey, this person uses these tools. Okay, now figuratively, I'm just kind of like letting you know, but I think it's important to know that you have to actually practice at this. Right? Practice at these strategies and figure out what's the best way to implement it also. So these are 3 different strategies that I've shown you. I'm going to end with this last one, which is the Nonprofit Strategy Revolution. Really, Dave LaPiana, that's the book there. Is the PowerPoint available to go back over? It is available. You can actually access it online. We have already downloaded all of our presentations, so you can access that immediately. And then this whole presentation will be available immediately following. Once our last session is done, you can actually go back and rewind it. You can go back and send it to people as well. So this for strategic planning and or strategy has only been around 40 years. Of course, was strategy happening before that? Of course. But for the last 40 years is where you started seeing a lot of people research on it, a lot of people writing articles on it, right? So this is the strategic planning model of the past. It was very, very easy for people to identify. They said, okay, if everybody can meet their individual goals, then each department will reach their goal, then we'll reach our annual goals, and then we'll reach our strategies or long-term strategic objectives our mission, visions, and our vision. Sorry about that. My presentation is a little bit smaller. It was going to be on your screen completely, but I wanted to be able to point things out. I'm a New Yorker, born and raised. I talk with my hands, and I talk extremely fast, which you probably have noticed already. So what I do here is that this model, this triangle, made a lot of sense, right? If an individual meets their goal, then us as a big team will meet our overall goal. Makes a lot of sense. The challenge is that they're dependent upon each level. Funny part about it is that if you ask somebody to do a strategic plan for you, you invited a consultant in, they still do this model. There's nothing wrong with it. I feel it just limits you to a certain extent. So I use this model. I've done some statewide plans, local plans, a nationwide strategic plan, and I use a model like this that you're not able to see, but I wanted, my point here is to get to you so you can understand what it actually means to have it be done in some level of a cycle. Right? So the question here is that they talk about what is our business before, as we get started, we're going to ask question, what is our business model? What is our first model that we're going to look at? The book is called, somebody asked about the book again. It's called the Nonprofit Strategy Revolution. Nonprofit Strategy Revolution. It's available on Amazon, pretty easy, pretty inexpensive book as well. So business model, where are we? What do we have? What are we going to finance and where we're going? If we just say, and we don't include this, we're just guessing, pulling things out of air. Oh, we should do this, we should do that. But often at times we are constrained by finances to a certain extent. So now we're going to start our product planning process knowing what we have available to us first. Second step here is the market awareness. What are the trends that are going on in our environment? Where are they? What's happening? What's going on with the market, right? So this way, if I'm talking about where we're going for the next 3 to 5 years, I'm already doing a trend analysis. The good thing I like about this book is they give you some online forms that you can use so that it makes it a little bit easier so you can ask the questions, and they provide some of those key questions for you as you continue to move through this model. So it's extremely helpful. But the thing is that I'm also identifying my competition. So look at this. Very early on, I know my limitations of finance, where my possibilities of finance are. I know what trends are going on. And then finally, I know what my competitors are doing. It's a competitive advantage. What are my competitors doing? So think about that. You could go through strategic planning, or you think about your last strategic plans just in 2 steps. Sometimes it hadn't been covered. Just in these first 2 steps, now you have all of this information. People say, how many people can I have in a room for my strategic planning? Well, you can't have 1,000 people in, right? You can't have the nation in a room, but I can have their data in the room. So I'm asking key questions, sometimes interviews, sometimes surveys, a number of different things so I can have this data in the room that could support the direction that we're going. So models are extremely important because it allows us to feed off of each other. So when I get to my competitive advantage, I have some of the data available to me. Competitive advantage, let me give you a couple of examples. Our staff are exceptional well than any other staff in the area. That's our competitive advantage. Safety is our competitive advantage. I knew this one organization who they were trying to raise some money because they wanted to expand the number of shelter beds that they have for their women. And I said, this is incredible. So they're raising some money, they're trying to figure it out. So oddly enough, all of at night, although that the beds were taken, there were people, women, who were there, sometimes even with their families, around the facility, either sleeping at the facility, outside the facility, a number of different ways. What they were able to identify with that as they started their growth process, because they saw the need rising, one of their competitive advantage was safety. They were providing people safety, so much so that people would go there knowing that a bed may not be available, but in the environment it was going to keep them safe. Right? So often at times, your competitive advantage sometimes is standing right in front of you, and you may not be able to identify it. So I ask you to step back a little bit and help yourself identify that. I like the term that Ron Heifetz does. He talks about the balcony and the dance floor. And sometimes in order for us to get to the issue, we need to go up into the dance floor because we can look down. On the dance floor, we're cutting a rug. We're having a good old time. We're doing a 2-step, right? But the challenge is we can only see what's in front of us. Whereas if we can leave the dance floor, go to the balcony and look down, we're able to see the exits. We're able to see where people are congregating. And sometimes for us, we need to go up into the balcony to look down at our organization, look down at some of our stakeholders, and to be able to say, okay, what's going on here, right? When I leave the dance floor, it gets quieter also. It provides some clarity for me. So these are some opportunities also there. So as I can say, as we see here, we've already gone a couple of ways through here, almost all the way around here, and we already have some good data to move forward. Some people say that the next step is the strategy screen is one of the most important ones, because now that I have all this data, I can write out something that says, in what situations will we move forward with new projects, for example. So one of the examples is that it should align with our competitive advantage. Why should we try and go into a new area when we know our competitive advantage is X, Y, and Z? So I'm going to make sure anything new we take on is on our X, Y, and Z, and then we're going to move forward with it. The reason I like the strategy team is I worked for a couple of mayors, and the mayor would come, somebody would come in and tell us something. Oh, what about this? And it's just like now the whole city, the whole environment is shifting. We're shifting here, we're shifting there. When you really want to be able to say, if we are going to move with this, one, does it align with our strategic goals? Two, does it align with our competitive advantage? We shouldn't just be shifting. And if sometimes there will be opportunities that come up where we need to shift, that's all fine, but we want to make sure we're asking our questions to make sure that we're in alignment as we move things into to the next position. So people look at this strategy screen as being a very, very important part of it. The next one's here asking some of the big questions. All right, what would happen if we decided to close down this program and open up this other program? So what are those big questions, those hard questions that we're going to need to ask ourselves as we continue to move forward? And this is one of them. And then we can test our strategies. And lastly, we can talk about action steps and implementation. Right? My students, as we do some of our environmental scans, which is looking at what's in our environment for specific organizations, I ask them, if you can tell me at the end of this paper how you're going to keep the strategic plan alive, you get extra credit. Right? Often at times, strategic plans are not made to sit on the shelf. I love our marketing people, but they make it look so beautiful that you don't want to touch it. Right? The goal here is, how do I continue to develop a document that we're going to continue to utilize? There's so many systems out there like Smartsheet, even Excel, for example. They have a tickler system. So 3 months in, it sees where you are. Are you at your goal? It sends out emails to people. You have to learn how to keep this alive. Right? You have to learn, how do I have a strategic planning committee for maybe our board that's comprised of board and staff members? They're going to meet quarterly to move this thing along. They're going to report to the board out on this. And then lastly is you want to make sure your leadership is supporting this prior to even starting. If your leadership is not on board, meaning your board, your ED, and it's being driven by some other department, you want to make sure that they're all signed off on it, they understand it, and they respect the importance of the process, because you're going to want to make sure you have all of that good data. So these are the models that we talked about a little bit. I talked about being a sound business model, looking at it from a market awareness standpoint, and then also how this all ties together. So the way the model ties together specifically with implementation is that I'm looking at it from an organizational standpoint. I'm also looking at it from a program standpoint. And then lastly, I'm looking at it from this other aspects. What I put here is I've added some different slides for you so that you can see some of the tools that people are using and some of the tools that are available for you. But in this one, when we start looking at our area and we start doing our environmental scan, we'll start asking some questions about what is our current geographic area? Who do we serve? Who do we not serve? Right? I've done this with some groups and I think, oh, let's just go. It's going to be like a couple of minutes. And meanwhile, we took 3 hours on who we serve and who we do not serve. Right? So we want to be clear on that. So for example, if a library says, oh, we serve people in our area. Oh, that's great. What about people outside of your area? Well, of course, we do people outside of our area also. Okay, great. What about online? Well, we do online also. So when you start asking yourself those questions, who do we serve and who do we not serve? Right? And it doesn't mean like we're not serving people for this reason. But if we're a child care organization, we don't serve adults. Right? So looking at organizations of who we serve, who we not serve, who are our customers and not our current customers, and then programs and services also. So looking at it from that aspect, what is it that we do? How do we do it? And also, how do we move things forward? Same thing here. If you look at it, when we talk about these sheets, I love them. The way that they document them out there is because they look at these sheets in a way to say, okay, what are our current services and programs? Where's our current funding come from, right? People often say that if we were to get $1 million, what would we do with it? Well, it's a lot of times you should have a strategy developed from that. But also you should know where we get our funding from and what we don't want our funding from. Right? I say you should know where you want your funding from, $5,000, $150. You should know before the money is in front of you. In times like this, it's really hard to turn down donations. I believe Nancy talked about this sometimes, and Dr. Roxanne, sometimes saying, okay, well, we're going to accept this money and not accept that money. Right? So there are opportunities where you can accept money and not accept other monies, and we can look at it through that. But I want to know beforehand, where does our organization sit? Right? Because all money is not going to be the best money for our organization, and particularly if we are not aligned in core values. It always goes back to core values for me, right? I believe relationships flourish when core values are in alignment. I believe relationships fall apart when core values are not in alignment, right? So what we want to do is look at those core values, ask ourselves those key questions as well, and then and look at that. So look, this is almost like a class with you, right? We're talking about what is our strategy? What is that going to look like? We're talking about strategy from the smallest stage, from how do we take something at an A stage, how do we get to a B stage, and what are our steps to get there, right? We talked about what is a strategy, what is a change process and what that looks like. If we were going to implement a change, what could that look like, right? Then we talked also about strategic planning. What does that look like? What is a different model of strategic planning, right? What is the first model, which has been traditional, and what is the second model, and what are the benefits of doing it from different ways, the components that are necessary. A good strategic planning process like this could take anywhere from 6 months. I've done 6 months and more, right? If somebody comes in and says, I can do it for you in 30 days, I would say, well, you might have to ask a few more questions, because those are not going to be enough questions that you have to ask. It's not going to be that quick. And you can't take the weekend to do it by yourself also. Engaging your community, engaging your stakeholders, where people feel like they have input into the direction of your organization, engaging your funders, and sometimes even engaging your competitors. Once we start that, we find out that there may be some opportunities for us to partner together. All right. I thank you so much for spending the time with me, not only through the strategy portion of it, but today we're going to have just one more session of just wrapping things up, and we look forward to coming right back shortly. Thank you.